Right now, in the southern reaches of the Red Sea, a United States Navy destroyer is cutting through dark water at roughly 18 knots. Its radar is active. Its electronic warfare suite is scanning every frequency within 100 miles. Its crew is at a heightened state of readiness that the Navy calls Condition 3. Weapons loaded, watch sections doubled, every horizon treated as a threat vector. The ship's name, its exact position, its speed, all of it is classified. And yet, within minutes of that destroyer leaving its last port, someone who is not American, not Yemeni, and not Iranian knows precisely where it is. That is not a hypothesis. That is the documented operational reality that has been quietly acknowledged by senior U.S. defense officials in testimony, in classified reporting that has since leaked into the analytical community, and in the patterns of attack that Houthi forces have demonstrated since October 2023. The timing, the targeting geometry, the selection of vessels, all of it points to an intelligence pipeline that extends far beyond what a non-state militia in northwestern Yemen could construct on its own. Here's the fact that mainstream coverage has spent 18 months dancing around without fully confronting: China is not a spectator in the Iran-linked conflict reshaping global shipping lanes. It is a participant, not with missiles, not with soldiers, with something that, in the modern era, is arguably more decisive than either: data. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how China's maritime surveillance infrastructure feeds positional intelligence into an adversarial network that is actively targeting Western commercial and military shipping. Exactly how that intelligence pipeline connects to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and from there to Houthi targeting cells in Yemen. And exactly what this means for the price of everything that moves by sea, which, as you will see, is nearly everything you own. Stay with me. To understand what is actually happening in the Red Sea corridor today, you have to go back to January 2021 and a decision made not in Tehran or Sana'a, but in Beijing. That month, China's State Council quietly ratified an expanded version of its maritime traffic safety law, which came into full effect in September 2021. On the surface, it was administrative housekeeping, updated regulations for vessels passing through Chinese territorial waters. But embedded within the law was a requirement that foreign military vessels give advance notice before entering Chinese-claimed maritime zones. Analysts at the time noted that this signaled a more assertive Chinese posture toward maritime sovereignty. What they did not fully appreciate was what was being built simultaneously on the other side of the ledger: the infrastructure to enforce it and to monitor everything else. Between 2019 and 2023, China expanded its Beidou satellite navigation system from a regional tool into a fully global constellation of 45 active satellites. Beidou is not merely a GPS equivalent. It is a two-way data system. Terminals using Beidou do not just receive positioning, they transmit it. And while Western shipping overwhelmingly relies on the American GPS constellation for navigation, nearly 70% of Chinese-manufactured maritime automatic identification system transponders, the devices that every commercial vessel over 300 gross tons is legally required to operate, route their data through Beidou's short message service. That creates a shadow data layer, one that is accessible to Chinese state infrastructure and, by extension, to whatever intelligence sharing arrangements Beijing has constructed with its partners. Now layer in what China built above the sea. Since 2016, the China National Space Administration and its commercial affiliates have launched a suite of what Beijing classifies as remote sensing satellites under programs including Yaogan, Gaofen, and the commercially labeled Jilin constellation, operated by Changguang Satellite Technology. The Jilin constellation alone, as of late 2024, comprises over 108 imaging satellites capable of revisiting any point on Earth's surface in under 10 minutes. They can resolve objects as small as 5 meters, which means they can identify a warship class, confirm antenna configurations, and track a carrier strike group's formation from orbit. Now go to November 2023. That is when the Houthi attacks on commercial shipping began in earnest. The first vessel targeted, the Galaxy Leader, seized on November 19th, was selected with a specificity that stunned maritime security analysts. The Houthis identified it as having Israeli ownership connections 3 layers deep in a corporate structure. That is not open-source intelligence work you can do with a Google search from a basement in Sana'a. That is the product of a professional intelligence apparatus with access to corporate registry databases, vessel tracking infrastructure, and real-time satellite confirmation. By February 2024, U.S. Central Command had documented over 45 Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. By the end of that year, the number exceeded 100 discrete incidents. The vessels targeted were not random. They followed a pattern, flagged under specific registries, owned by companies with connections to Israel or the United States, traveling specific routes at specific intervals. A pattern that required continuous real-time positional data. The Houthis, for all their battlefield tenacity, do not have satellites. They do not have the SIGINT infrastructure to produce that kind of targeting picture independently. Someone is giving it to them. The conduit, as assessed by multiple Western intelligence services, runs through Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, specifically its intelligence and cyber units operating out of facilities near Bandar Abbas and on Qeshm Island. Iran has had a formal intelligence sharing arrangement with Beijing since at least 2021, when the two countries signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement, a document that specifically included security and intelligence cooperation as a pillar. That agreement was not a diplomatic abstraction. It was an operational framework, and its consequences are now being measured in sunk ships, rerouted cargo lanes, and price signals that run from the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to the shelves of supermarkets in Manchester, Mumbai, and Milwaukee. Let us now examine the military dimension of this with the precision it deserves. The weapon systems that the Houthi forces have employed against shipping in the Red Sea and against U.S. Navy vessels specifically are not improvised. They represent a multi-domain anti-access toolkit that is more sophisticated than anything a non-state actor has ever fielded in recorded history, and that sentence is not hyperbole. Let me explain what the precedent was and why this breaks it. Prior to 2023, the most sophisticated non-state maritime attack in modern history was probably the 2000 USS Cole bombing, a waterborne improvised explosive device that killed 17 sailors and required a contact approach. Hezbollah's strike on the Israeli INS Hanit in 2006 using a C-802 anti-ship cruise missile was notable, but Iran effectively hand-operated the system for them. What the Houthis have demonstrated since late 2023 is categorically different. Autonomous launch, over-the-horizon targeting, multi-vector saturation attacks, and an ability to reconstitute capability after each degradation campaign. The primary systems in play are the Quds-3 and Quds-4 land attack cruise missiles, which are Houthi-designated derivatives of Iran's Sumar cruise missile, itself derived from the Soviet-era Kh-55. These carry estimated ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, putting virtually all of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and portions of the northwestern Indian Ocean within their reach. The anti-ship variant of this family, designated by Western analysts as the Quds-3 ASM, uses a terminal seeker that analysts at CSIS assessed in early 2024 as likely incorporating Iranian upgraded infrared and radar homing derived from Chinese technology transfers. The second system is the Shahed 136 and its naval variant, the Shahed 238. These are one-way attack drones, loitering munitions that fly at roughly 185 kilometers per hour, carry a warhead of approximately 40 kilograms, and are extraordinarily cheap to produce. Iran manufactures them at scale. The unit cost is estimated by the Royal United Services Institute at between $20,000 and $50,000 per airframe. The cost of an SM-2 interceptor missile fired by a U.S. Navy destroyer to shoot one down is approximately $2. $1 million. Every exchange rate calculation in that arithmetic favors the attacker. The Houthis have fired these in salvos of 8 to 12 simultaneously, overwhelming point defense systems through sheer saturation. The third and most strategically significant system is the Houthi ballistic missile inventory, specifically the Tophan and Hatem series, which are enhanced variants of Iran's Fateh 110 family. These are solid-fueled, road-mobile, and capable of ranges up to 1,500 kilometers. Solid fuel means fast launch, under 15 minutes from canister to ignition, and minimal pre-launch signature. This matters enormously for U.S. Navy defense planning. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers operating in the Red Sea are equipped with the AN/SPY-6 radar and can engage incoming ballistic missiles with SM-3 Block IB interceptors. But those interceptors cost $12 million each. And the Houthis have fired enough ballistic missiles at U.S. and Allied vessels since 2023 to have degraded the interceptor inventories of the destroyer squadron in theater by an estimated 30 to 40%, according to reporting by Breaking Defense in late 2024. Here is something that no naval strategist had fully modeled before in the context of a non-state actor. A sustained rate of fire that depletes the defender's magazine faster than resupply can replace it. U.S. destroyers carry between 90 and 96 vertical launch system cells. They cannot be reloaded at sea. They must transit to a port, Djibouti, Bahrain, or further, to replenish. During that transit and port time, the vessel is off station. The operational tempo the Houthis have maintained with Iranian logistics and intelligence support is deliberately calibrated to keep U.S. vessels cycling in and out of theater rather than maintaining a continuous deterrent presence. What military strategists are actually saying, and this is not public posturing, this is drawn from think tank assessments, congressional testimony, and the private statements of retired flag officers, is that the Red Sea campaign has exposed a fundamental mismatch between American naval architecture, which is optimized for high-end peer warfare against a single threat, and the sustained, low-cost attrition campaign of a well-supplied, non-state force. The options now on the table include expanded strikes on Houthi production facilities inside Yemen, which the US and UK have already attempted with limited lasting effect, and something more significant: a direct strike campaign against the intelligence and logistics nodes inside Iran that are enabling the targeting pipeline. That second option has not been exercised. The reason it has not is the subject of the diplomatic section of this video. This is the section that connects the military event to your life. And I want to be direct about the mechanism because it is more concrete than you might expect. When the Houthi campaign against Red Sea shipping began in November 2023, approximately 12% of global trade by value and roughly 30% of global container traffic transited the Bab el-Mandeb Strait annually. The alternative route around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa adds approximately 3,500 nautical miles and 10 to 14 additional days of sailing time per voyage. That does not sound dramatic until you calculate what it costs. A single large container vessel, a 15,000 TEU ship of the type operated by Maersk or CMA CGM, burns approximately 200 metric tons of fuel per day at sea steaming speed. At a fuel cost of roughly $650 per metric ton for low-sulfur marine fuel, adding 12 additional sea days costs approximately $1, $56 million in fuel alone per transit. Multiply that across the roughly 22,000 container vessel transits that previously passed through the Red Sea annually, and you are looking at a structural cost increase to global shipping of approximately $34 billion per year in fuel alone, before factoring in crew costs, port delays, insurance premiums, and charter rate increases. The insurance dimension is significant on its own. War risk insurance premiums for Red Sea transits, which stood at approximately zero. EO 1% of cargo value before October 2023 had spiked to between 0, 5 and 1% by mid-2024, representing a 50 to 100-fold increase. For a vessel carrying $100 million in cargo, that is an additional $500,000 to $1 million in insurance cost per transit. Shipping companies absorbed a portion of this through rate increases. The rest flows downstream to importers, then to wholesalers, then to retailers, and ultimately to you. The oil and energy transmission is the most direct line. The Red Sea corridor handles approximately 2 million barrels of oil per day, primarily Saudi and Emirati crude bound for Europe and Asia, and refined products flowing in both directions. When tankers began diverting around the Cape, Brent crude added a structural risk premium of between $4 and $8 per barrel that is not fully unwound. At $87 per barrel as a baseline, that premium represents between 4, 6, and 9. 2% of the commodity price, embedded in every gallon of gasoline, every unit of petrochemical feedstock, every plastic container and fertilizer bag produced downstream. The fertilizer connection is the one that receives the least attention and has the most humanitarian weight. Yemen itself is a humanitarian catastrophe, but the global cascade runs through a specific trade, urea and ammonia fertilizers produced in the Gulf and Egypt, which transit the Red Sea northward to European and South Asian agricultural markets. India, which runs import-dependent agricultural cycles in its northern plains, has seen urea import costs increase by approximately 18% since the route disruption began, according to data from the Fertilizer Association of India. That feeds directly into the cost of wheat and rice. Now let me put this in concrete terms for the nations most exposed by reserve arithmetic. Japan imports approximately 90% of its energy. Its strategic petroleum reserve covers roughly 150 days of consumption, one of the largest in the world, built precisely for scenarios like this. South Korea holds approximately 106 days. India, which has expanded its reserves in recent years, maintains roughly 64 days of cover at current consumption rates. These are buffer times, not immune times. A prolonged closure or sustained threat to the Red Sea corridor does not immediately empty these reserves. It begins drawing them down at an accelerated rate, while simultaneously making refill more expensive. The clock starts ticking from the moment the tanker fleet reroutes. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. Because the next chapter of this story, the one involving Chinese direct investment in Iranian port infrastructure, and what it means for the long-term geography of energy trade, is one we are tracking closely. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from a Houthi targeting cell in northwestern Yemen, receiving satellite positional data routed through an intelligence chain that connects to Beijing, to the price of the fuel in your car, the cost of the medication in your cabinet, and the grocery bill you paid last week. The diplomatic picture in this conflict is one of the most complex multilateral arrangements in contemporary geopolitics, and the gap between what parties say publicly and what they are negotiating privately is wider than almost any other active conflict. Begin with the United States. Washington's public position, maintained through multiple administrations, is that it will not negotiate with the Houthis, whom it redesignated as a specially designated global terrorist organization in January 2024. The private reality, documented in reporting by the Wall Street Journal and confirmed by Omani diplomatic sources, is that indirect communications channels have remained intermittently open through Muscat since at least early 2024. Oman has served as Washington's back channel to Tehran since the Obama administration's pre-JCPOA negotiations, and that infrastructure did not dissolve when the JCPOA collapsed. What the U.S. needs to be able to tell its domestic audience, that it is not rewarding terrorism. What it needs privately, a mechanism to reduce the operational tempo in the Red Sea without a large-scale military escalation that it is not prepared to sustain. Iran's position is more layered than Western coverage typically conveys. Tehran does not publicly acknowledge operational command over the Houthis. It frames its relationship as one of solidarity with an independent resistance movement. The private reality, which is embedded in IRGC command communications that Western intelligence has partially penetrated, is that the IRGC-QF provides not just weapons, but mission authorization thresholds. Individual attack decisions against commercial shipping are largely Houthi autonomous within those thresholds. But attacks on U.S. Navy vessels, or on vessels that would constitute a clear casus belli for a major U.S. military response, require IRGC senior authorization. What Iran needs to tell its domestic audience, that it is supporting the Palestinian cause through the axis of resistance. What it needs privately, an off-ramp from a confrontation that is drawing international economic scrutiny to its oil exports at a moment when it is trying to sustain 80 per barrel oil revenues. China's role here is the most consequential and the most opaque. Beijing's official position is neutrality. It calls for dialogue, de-escalation, and protection of freedom of navigation, which is a position of such studied ambiguity as to be almost meaningless. Here's what China's private incentive structure actually looks like. It is the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil, purchasing at a discount of approximately $10 to $15 per barrel below market price, funneling roughly 1.5 million barrels per day through a gray market shipping network. It has no interest in an Iran that is either defeated or drawn into a conflict so severe that its oil production capacity is physically degraded. It also has no interest in a U.S. military posture in the Persian Gulf that is diminished to zero, because the U.S. security umbrella, paradoxically, provides the stable environment in which Chinese commercial shipping also operates. Beijing is threading a needle, allowing its intelligence infrastructure to support Iranian proxy operations sufficiently to keep U.S. naval resources tied down and U.S. strategic bandwidth consumed, without pushing the confrontation to a point that disrupts the global trading system on which Chinese export growth depends. The unexpected mediator worth watching is Pakistan. Islamabad has maintained formal military relationships with both Saudi Arabia and Iran simultaneously, a diplomatic feat of considerable complexity. In early 2024, Pakistani Chief of Army Staff General Asim Munir made a rare joint appearance with both Saudi and Iranian counterparts at a regional security forum, and Pakistani ISI back channels have been assessed by Indian intelligence analysts as a secondary communication pathway between Gulf states and Tehran. Pakistan's incentive is straightforward, economic. Its $3 billion IMF bailout, its $6 billion in Saudi investment commitments, and its remittance flows from Gulf-based workers all depend on regional stability. Islamabad wants this conflict to have a ceiling. The Gulf states, particularly the UAE, occupy a position of profound strategic dissonance. They are formal U.S. security partners, hosts to U.S. military installations, and simultaneously among the most aggressive pursuers of economic relationships with Beijing. Abu Dhabi's Abraham Accords normalization with Israel, signed in September 2020, made it a potential Houthi target, and indeed Houthi drones struck near Abu Dhabi International Airport in January 2022. The UAE is simultaneously a conduit for goods that reach Iran despite sanctions, a host to Iranian business interests worth an estimated $300 billion, and a quietly active back channel between Washington and Tehran through its own intelligence apparatus. Let us now examine the three scenarios that analysts are modeling for what comes next. Not speculation, structured scenario analysis based on the current balance of capabilities, incentives, and constraints. The first scenario is a negotiated resolution. This requires, at minimum, three things happening simultaneously. A Gaza ceasefire that Iran can point to as a political victory for the axis of resistance, giving the Houthis a face-saving rationale to reduce their operational tempo. A structured U.S. diplomatic engagement with Iran on the nuclear file that provides Tehran with enough sanctions relief to stabilize its currency, which has lost over 70% of its value since 2018, and a Chinese facilitation role, specifically Beijing, using its leverage over Tehran to press for de-escalation in exchange for U.S. acknowledgement of certain Chinese maritime interests in the South China Sea. This scenario is possible. It is not probable in the near term, because it requires all three of these parallel tracks to advance simultaneously, and each one individually faces enormous domestic political obstacles in Washington, Tehran, and Beijing. The U.S. Congress would resist any perceived concession to Iran. Iranian hardliners regard the nuclear file as non-negotiable, and Beijing views any explicit mediating role as an implicit acknowledgement of its intelligence-sharing relationship with Iran, something it will not do publicly. The second scenario is continued attrition. This is actually the current state, dressed in forward-looking language. It describes a situation in which the Red Sea attacks continue at a rate of roughly 10 to 20 incidents per month. US and UK strikes on Houthi infrastructure continue without decisively degrading capability. Global shipping continues its Cape rerouting at enormous cost, and the diplomatic channels remain open but inconclusive. The week-by-week arithmetic of this scenario is grim. Each week of Red Sea disruption at current levels costs the global shipping industry approximately $650 million in additional operating costs. Each week extends the exposure of nations like Japan and South Korea to energy supply chain risk. Each week runs down U.S. Navy interceptor inventories in theater. Each week provides China with real-world intelligence on U.S. naval doctrine, reaction times, and system performance. Intelligence that has direct application to a potential Taiwan contingency. This scenario can persist for years. The Yemen war itself has already lasted a decade. The cost is distributed broadly enough that no single party bears enough of it to force a resolution. The third scenario is the one that strategic analysts discuss in closed workshops, but that governments will not name publicly. It begins with a specific threshold, a Houthi strike that kills U.S. Navy personnel aboard a warship in sufficient numbers to constitute what American law and precedent defines as an act of war, requiring a kinetic response against the state sponsor, Iran. In February 2024, 3 U.S. Army soldiers were killed at Tower 22 in Jordan by an Iranian-supplied drone. The U.S. response was a significant strike package against IRGC-linked targets in Iraq and Syria, but it deliberately avoided targets inside Iran. That restraint reflected a calculated assessment that crossing the Iranian border with kinetic force would trigger a response that escalates into something Washington was not prepared to manage. But that assessment has a ceiling. A Houthi strike that sinks a U.S. destroyer, a scenario that naval analysts consider possible given the saturation attack tactics being used, or kills more than 50 American personnel in a single incident would create domestic political pressure for a response that goes beyond Syria and Iraq. A direct strike on IRGC naval infrastructure inside Iran, specifically the facilities on Qeshm Island and near Bandar Abbas, is the most discussed threshold option. What comes after that is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. Iran has pre-positioned Fateh 110 ballistic missiles with ranges sufficient to strike every U.S. base in the Gulf region. It has Hezbollah assets in Lebanon capable of a multi-front missile campaign that would overwhelm Israeli air defenses. It has mining capabilities that could close the Strait of Hormuz to tanker traffic within 72 hours of an order to execute. A closure of Hormuz, through which 21 million barrels of oil pass every single day, would send Brent crude from its current range of $82 to $87 per barrel toward $150 within a week. That is not a projection made lightly. It is the baseline estimate from every major energy market model. And that threshold, the threshold that transforms a proxy conflict into a direct great power confrontation in the most oil-critical waterway on Earth, has not yet been crossed. But the architecture being constructed around it grows more elaborate by the month. Let me bring this home, not metaphorically, literally, to your home. The fuel in your car right now carries embedded in its pump price a risk premium generated by the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea. The consumer electronics you ordered online, the laptop, the phone, the appliance, traveled on a vessel that either paid elevated war risk insurance transiting the Red Sea, paid $1, $5 million in extra fuel to go around Africa, or sat in a port queue waiting for space on a rerouted ship. The food on your table, specifically the wheat, the rice, the cooking oil, was grown with fertilizer whose price was partly set by a disrupted supply chain running through the Gulf of Aden. The medication in your cabinet arrived on a temperature-controlled container that added 12 days to its transit time, requiring additional cold chain infrastructure costs that are passed to insurers and then to payers. The electricity price in your city is set at the margin by liquefied natural gas spot prices, which are directly influenced by tanker routing efficiency through the Red Sea corridor. Watch the charter rates for Capesize vessels out of Singapore. They are the leading indicator of how much the rerouting is costing in real time. Watch the Iran nuclear negotiation back channels through Oman. Their activity level tells you whether a diplomatic ceiling is beidou constructed. Watch the Beidou constellation's expansion timeline, because the next generation of terminals, scheduled for commercial deployment by 2026, will increase coverage density in the Indian Ocean by approximately 40%. The Red Sea that existed before October 2023 is not coming back. The shipping industry has already begun the process of modeling a permanent bifurcated routing world, one in which Cape of Good Hope transits are not the emergency alternative, but the structural default for a significant portion of Asia-Europe trade. That repricing is permanent. It is baked into the next generation of vessel orders, the next round of port infrastructure investment, and the next decade of insurance actuarial tables. Here is the open question that this video cannot answer, because no one can answer it yet. At what point does China's calculation change? Beijing is currently threading the needle, using its intelligence infrastructure to impose costs on U.S. naval posture without triggering a confrontation that disrupts the trading system on which its own economy depends. But that calculation is not static. If the United States moves toward direct military engagement with Iran, if the Strait of Hormuz closes, if global oil prices hit $150 per barrel, China's economy, which imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day, would be among the most severely damaged in the world. At that point, does Beijing use its leverage over Tehran to pull the conflict back from the edge? Or does it calculate that a United States mired in a Gulf War is a United States that cannot focus on the Taiwan Strait and allow the escalation to continue? That question, the question of where China's true red line sits, is the one that will determine whether the next chapter of this story is managed competition or something far more consequential. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.